Good afternoon and welcome for joining us for our fourth installment of the NACDA Social Justice in College Athletics series. I'm NACDA CEO Bob Vecchione, and we're so glad you could join us today to continue these important conversations around difficult topics in our industry and in the world. Today's discussion will highlight a topic that many departments across the country have experienced in varying capacities in recent years. The student athletes that we work with on a day-to-day basis are growing into their own, and as part of that, often seek ways to use their voices and platforms to be agents of change in their communities and in our world. This afternoon's session, titled Lessons Learned, Reevaluation of Past Student Athlete Protests, will examine a few past case studies of student athlete activism and reflect upon the actions taken as well as lessons learned. This afternoon, through the help of NACDA Social Justice and College Athletics Task Force member and MOA President China Jude, we're pleased to welcome an esteemed panel of colleagues to share their past experiences within these scenarios. China will moderate today's session with NACMA and NACDA past President Joe Castiglione, Director of Athletics at the University of Oklahoma, Pat Ivey, Associate Athletics Director for Student Health and Performance at the University of Louisville, and NAC past President Jude Cromer, who's currently Director of Athletics at Ohio University. Panelists, thank you for taking time to be with us today. Now, before we begin, we ask all of you to ask questions through that little chat box you see on the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will make certain to leave about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the session for questions. After that, we are looking forward to a great session today. China, thank you for all the work you've done to put this together. Panelists, thank you in advance. And China, please take it away.
Great, thanks, Bob. I really appreciate it. I greatly appreciate you allowing us to use this NACDA platform to tap into what I would describe, or we are describing, as case studies on campus protests. Thanks to Katie Newman for fielding questions and working on the technical side of the session. I want to welcome Joe, Julie, and Pat to the discussion. I specifically selected you because of the issues that occurred on your campuses at the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Ivey, when you were at the University of Missouri, and Julie, when you were at the University of Arkansas, and the significant role that you play to address the issues. I've asked each of you to be as candid as you possibly can be to speak about the steps, vulnerabilities, and lessons learned. So before we get started, I have to say some names. 2014, Tanisha Anderson, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Gabriela Navarez, Aki Barley, and Eric Gardner. Thank you. We have a lot to cover in a short period of time, so let's get started. In March 2015, the University of Oklahoma community witnessed a video showing racist chants by a fraternity. Eventually, instead of practicing, the football team held a silent protest in response to the video. Now, Joe, I'm sure, like most athletic directors, you don't like surprises. So speak on when and how you first heard about these racist chants that occurred on your campus, and were you prepared for these protests?
Well, thank you, China. It's great to join my colleagues, and hello to everyone that's joined us today. I was with many of the situations we've experienced in our world. This was not expected. It actually came to light, I'd say, later on a Sunday night, and it had a sort of a root in social media, and in a more of an obscure social media site at that. I actually learned about it from my son, who was a freshman here at Oklahoma at the time. And he showed me his skill set and navigating a lot of social media sites I really wasn't thinking he was navigating, but he called me about 9 o'clock on a Sunday night and asked if I had heard about this video that was posted. I had not. It had been posted on a national site, but a Greek life type of site, not anything we would consider more common today. But it quickly circulated around our campus. And from there, we were trying to figure out what the video was. I had not seen it, did not have access to that site. So I had to, find ways to get it. But in the midst of trying to get it, one of our football players released a profanity-laced response to the video. So I actually saw that before I saw the video, and I'm trying to figure out, what in the world was going on with this video and what did it contain. Well, once I saw the video, it was clearly hate speech. It wasn't just a bias or an attitude of bias. It included hate speech. In fact, we needed some time later to unpack how this all happened, but it was a song that had been rewritten to the tune of "If You're Happy and You Know It, Clap Your Hands." I just say that because the irony is part of what I would say, how it traces back to systemic racism. The song itself wasn't originally intended for that. It was, a parody to the original song. So long story short, our minds are racing. How could this happen? OU is a very friendly and welcoming campus. The backdrop of what had happened in Ferguson, Tamir Rice, all of that was topics on our campus, but those discussions were open. They were taking place. So, we didn't really anticipate something like this. It was centered in a fraternity on a date night party that somebody had videotaped it on a cell phone and posted the video on this Greek Life website. So it became public. We knew about it late at night, and through the night, a couple of student groups started forming plans for a protest that would take place at 7 a.m. The following Monday morning. And we obviously launched into trying to communicate with both our coaches and our internal staff and some of our student leaders to make sure we were tracking. This was obviously a situation that was being basically managed by the campus, but with a department that is the most diverse on a campus, in athletics, we knew that it was going to engage more and more of our student athletes, especially when our student athlete, when a football players released that video.
Thank you. 2015, Tanisha Fonville, Freddie Gray, Michelle Cuso. September 12, 2015, on the heels of the Michael Brown incident, Missouri Student Association president wrote in a Facebook post that racial slurs were yelled at him on the campus of the University of Missouri. The post went viral among the Missouri students. 12 days later, students held a Racism Lives Here rally, criticizing the university for their late response. A graduate student began a hunger strike. Dr. Ivey, eventually the football team joined forces and said that they would boycott all football-related activities until specific demands were met. What was your role at Missouri, and when and how did you learn about the football team's protests? Did you know that this was going to happen?
So I'll start with my role, because I had a role and then I had responsibilities. So sometimes those responsibilities extend beyond our roles. So I was the associate athletics director for athletic performance, and I also oversaw nutrition. Now my responsibilities, I was also in charge of the social responsibility programming for all of our male student athletes. So to be able to be in charge of the athletic performance for all athletes and the social responsibility programming for all male student athletes, I didn't do it by myself. Had a great staff, and we had a really good committee. We called it the Men for Men Committee. And we talked about many different social topics years before 2015, many years. And I can tell you, we did discuss race prior to the situation that was happening on campus. We knew about Mike Brown a year before and what had happened, and we were preparing and having those conversations. Now, where I was when I found out about the football players protesting, it was if you're involved in a football team and it's bye week and you get 2 days, that's vacation. So I considered it vacation. It was my father's birthday weekend. We were somewhere camping away 20 miles outside of Columbia, and just having a really good time when I got the phone call that something was happening on campus and our athletes were involved, particularly our football team. So at that point is when I knew that I had to become engaged, being associated with the football team and in charge of social response, being the chair of the Men for Men Committee, which was in charge of social responsibility program. You're on mute, Dr.
Thank you. So 2016, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile. So Julie, you served as the Deputy Athletics Director at the University of Arkansas when 6 of your women's basketball team kneeled for during the national anthem during an exhibition game or before an exhibition game. So what was your connection with the team? What did you know? When did you know it? Were you ready for this?
So first, thank you to you, China, for all the work you've done to pull this together, and to NACDA for hosting us, and obviously to my colleagues on the panel as well. I think, like we've heard from Dr. Ivey, there were several things happening in the years leading up to the demonstration on our campus that gave us an opportunity to engage in some of these issues. And I had done so through my work as the sport administrator and senior woman administrator at Arkansas, which were my roles connected directly to women's basketball. And if I could respectfully, I would like to add a name to your list, and that is Terrence Crutcher, who was involved in an incident in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is not far from the Fayetteville campus. And in fact, one of our student athletes who was from Tulsa was connected to him through family friendships. And that occurred late in the summer of 2016. And when, for those of you who are familiar with the basketball calendar, for a few weeks in August, the basketball teams typically have an opportunity to take a little break, Dr. Ivey, before they come back and start their training. So it is often vacation and downtime for a lot of the staffs in that sport, as well, as many of us know. And so our staff had also scattered for a little bit and then came back together after a couple-week break in August. And there was definitely a sense among the team late in that summer, before the incident in Tulsa in which Terrence Crutcher was killed, that led to what I would say informal gatherings in our student common areas, in our training tables, in our academic center. And our student athlete development staff was working to quickly develop programming to provide a more organized setting for that. But I will tell you, the death of that gentleman raised the stakes for a team that rallied around one of their teammates. And unfortunately, at the time, like, our relationships with our coaching staff were disconnected personally and primarily focused on the basketball relationship for that women's basketball program. So as a result, our players were talking with others, but not necessarily their coaches, about some of the things that were going on in their lives and some of the things they were trying to process as young Black women in this country. And so I was sitting in my desk on the day that our head basketball coach came up from practice and said, a day and a half before our first exhibition game, which happened to be at home, that he thought his team was going to, so he thought some members of his team, potentially the whole team, but some members of his team were going to kneel during the national anthem.
Great, thank you. Well, we're gonna now dig a little bit deeper, because now you found out, and each one of you found out in different ways. So Joe, what was the first thing you did? What were some of the steps you took once you found out to collect the information that you need in order to determine what those next steps are?
Well, as disgusted and angry and truly astonished as I was, my mind kept jumping back and forth. It's a campus issue. It's a fraternity. Is this a prank? Is this what is this? It obviously was a video we could see. People were dressed up. It was a date night party. They were on a bus coming back. How extensive is this? The beginning? Is this all it is? And we had to think through what our role could be in this. But again, as I mentioned earlier, because one of our student athletes had posted a response to it, we were in the middle of it. I certainly understood his and anyone's anger once we saw the video itself. We were just trying to figure out what our role could be in leading our student athletes in the best possible manner. I called my senior associate AD, who oversees all of our academics and student life at the time. She's currently the athletic director at Colgate. We initially tried to connect with all of our internal student athlete leaders, wanted to get their take if they knew. We informed them if they didn't. We wanted to hear what they were hearing from their peers, called fellow campus leaders to see what was being done on campus, what we could do to help. These things are unfolding, without any true structure, even though you talk about how you'd handle incidents, they don't all happen just exactly the way you plan them to. Mentioned the protest. I knew right away that we had to be present with our student athletes. So we were following the development of that during literally the wee hours of the morning. And they were, the student athletes all agreed to meet at a place and walk over to the center of campus where the protest was going to occur around 7 a.m. So I was there along with several of our staff members, and coaches would join later. We wanted to be with them, walk with them, really show a level of solidarity with them. We were all learning about it, together, and whatever we were going to face, we wanted to face it together. Once we got over to the center of campus that morning, the president of the university would join and was, exceedingly influential in helping address the situation from its beginning and then taking action steps. This is not a point where you get involved in a lot of philosophy. People want to know what the action's going to be. And he took steps right away to address the situation. The fraternity, the students involved launched an investigation which would lead to immediate closure of the fraternity in 24 hours.
So really, you didn't truly have like a crisis plan for student protests or anything like that?
Not in this particular case, because it was happening so quickly. We've since developed, a response, approach. But in this particular case, I will say that the fact that we had been meeting with student athletes and had open training, dialogue, had developed strong relationships with our leaders, that paid enormous dividends. So we weren't really starting from scratch. It's not, we may not have had a specific plan for this situation, but because we had already spent a great deal of time in the area of DE&I education and building trusting relationships with our student athletes in a variety of different groups that focused on a wide variety of opportunities to grow on our campus. That helped us in this point because their leadership and our ability to be intentional, empowering them would prove to be huge in the long run.
Wonderful. Well, it's great to put it on the front end. So Dr. Ivey, so you get this phone call. Are you in your car? I mean, how did you handle that? Who was the first individual or individuals who you contacted once you found out?
Well, excuse me. Former players were the ones who contacted me, okay, saying, "Coach, you need to get to campus. Something's going on with the team, and with all of the issues that are going on campus, you need to get there and figure out what's going on." And so I spent the majority of that day just trying to talk to former players. The next morning I woke up, I understood that there would be some sort of gathering on campus. At that point, I talked to a few friends of mine that happen to be lawyers, and I said, you know, what could I be getting myself into? And they advised me to make sure that I sent an email to my supervisors, all the way up from the football coach to my direct supervisor, the athletics director, the senior women's administrator, and maybe a few other people, compliance. And I just let them know, this is what I've heard. This is what I'm going to go on campus. I'm going to gather information, and I'll report back whatever I find out. So I received that confirmation. When I arrived to campus, I ended up speaking with our chancellor and my direct supervisor. We had some conversations as we were also speaking with students and just trying to understand exactly what was going on. There was an area called Tent City, and this was where all of the students were gathering on campus to centralize. What I came away with is, one, I did not see any of our football players. So I thought that was strange. Since I'm called to campus, I'm walking around, I'm trying to find them. And I got to the point where I met up with a couple of the former players, and I determined that I don't see anything. I checked back out with my supervisor. I was headed to my car when I received a text or a phone call from the head coach saying, "Hey, what's going on campus? I'm understanding that our players are not going to play." I said, "Coach, I don't see anyone here. I haven't seen one player." I said, "I'm going to go back." I was at my car. I go back, and that's when the text messages started. The tweet, the players released the tweet that we're not playing, and my phone is just buzzing. It's just going off. And at that point, I reached out to one of the team leaders, and he said, "Yes, coach, when we know more, we'll let you know." And it was a really short conversation where we're getting everything organized. At that point, I found out that they were going to have a team meeting the next day, and then we were going to have a players only meeting, and then we had a team meeting after that. That included the athletics director, all of the coaches, all of the and the staff that was directly tied to the football team. And at that point is when you see the famous picture of us in the dining hall, all locked arm in arm, saying we support our players. At that point, what we were supporting, we were still finding out and learning exactly what it was that we were supporting. And of course, we gathered a lot of information and it grew. And I think that takes it up to the point where you wanted me to answer that question.
So as a follow-up, the photo with everyone locking arms, who came up with that idea?
That was from our players. That was from our team leaders, our captains. They wanted to show everyone that we were, that there was support for them, and them supporting their fellow students. That's what they were doing. They wanted to support their fellow students and give them a platform, I guess, to magnify their voice is what they told us. And that's what the photo for them represented.
I appreciate that. Thank you. So Julie, you were a part of some coaching of those student athletes once you found out?
We did. Once I found out, my office happened to be next door to the athletic director's office, and he happened to be on campus and available enough on that afternoon that we could move his calendar around. And he and I and a few others went down to practice and talked with the players at the end of practice. And I think at the time, I think at the time our coach was, he was surprised. I think he was a little bit worried about what was about to transpire and unsure of what to do, which I suppose in some ways is understandable given his background, and he was a relatively new coach, relatively new to the program. And we gathered with them and heard them out, and it was very clear in listening to our players that they had been thinking about this for a while, that they had been talking about this within their own circle for a while, that they had well-developed rationale for what they wanted to do, and that the symbolism of being involved in the demonstrative act of kneeling during the national anthem was having a moment, at least among their generation, at that time, that summer, that year. Colin Kaepernick had knelt, and it was a hot topic. And many of us were talking in administrative settings and circles about what would happen if anyone decided to kneel, but it was still a very fresh topic. Different than this summer, when we've seen so many teams march together, kneel together, take additional, take some steps and some actions publicly together that weren't happening in 2015 or 2016, even if the conversations were happening. And then when you tie in the national anthem and what that represents to many people, and the interpretations of that action by a lot of people, not only the people who are demonstrating in that way, but by others who are projecting and interpreting what that means to them. It was a relatively simple act, relatively short act compared to hunger strikes and some of the other things that we're talking about even in this call, and yet it was so of the moment that it was white hot, and they clearly had thought their way through this. And so I think for us as administrators, that conversation turned on a comment made by one of the young women who was from Arkansas and was highly recruited in Arkansas households, and now beyond, is very well known in women's college basketball. And she said to us and face to face, with our athletic director, she said, there will be no other time in my life that anyone will listen to me in the way that they will hear me now as I'm a Razorback. I grew up in the state. I know what it means to be a Black woman in this state. This is my time, and it is my responsibility before this moment passes to say something about this. And it was incredibly powerful, and it shifted the dynamic of the conversation. And we began talking about then how those young women could explain the rationale they shared with us and could communicate what was behind their action so that it wouldn't be co-opted by others. And it was actually, I think, a very good conversation And the plan coming out of that meeting was to record a video that 3 players would appear in, and each have 30 seconds or so to describe why they either were choosing to kneel in 2 cases, or in another case, choosing not to kneel, because not all the team had decided to kneel, but they all wanted to communicate unity together as a team. And we made arrangements to record that video the next day so it could be played as part of the pregame lineup during the game the following night. And I would say this is where an important lesson comes in the next day, in the development of that video and the communication with our campus partners about those plans. The video was determined did not meet university policy. Let's say to be able to be shown in an arena. And sometimes this is about how quickly things happen and decisions have to be made. And if you haven't had ongoing conversations with others outside your department leading up to this, we sometimes, I think, respond in ways that we might not if we had a little bit more time to air it out and to consider what we're doing. And so the video was not shown. And it created, I think, an even more dramatic moment because word had gotten out that this was happening. And, for an exhibition game, we had 10 times the media we would typically have for a women's basketball game, not necessarily the crowd. And the moment that they knelt that night, there were a dozen TV cameras that came out onto the court and got, tight shots of them. And by the end of the game, there were live local break-ins into, local TV channels and broadcasts. They were teasing the 10 o'clock news, and Facebook had lit up. Now, we were at the game, and we were prepared with security at the game. We were prepared with people keeping an eye on our students coming and going from parking lot in and out. And we were prepared with in-venue security should there be some sort of immediate response. And there were a few boos, and there was a little bit, but it really was relatively calm inside the venue. And then we just played basketball. And at the end of the game, as with everyone, there's a post-game press conference, and we chose that opportunity to let the young women, the same 3 young women who had recorded the video, have a chance in the post-game press conference to share their rationale and explain their decision. And they were phenomenal. To this day, I'm incredibly proud of them and the wide-ranging reasons that they articulated, both for standing and not demonstrating, and demonstrating. And none of it was, very little of it was recorded or covered because it was already out. And others had spent the few hours that we were in game playing a basketball game, had spent that time creating a narrative around it that then led to an overwhelming backlash.
Well, I tell you what, with the WNBA playing a significant part in voicing their concerns and being engaged on social justice issues, I tell you what, your young ladies at Arkansas was ahead of their time, and we really appreciate that. But Joe, I want to piggyback on what Julie was talking about in regards to the media. So how do you navigate through the media, the messaging? Did you work with your communications staff and what that looks like in terms of supporting the team? How do you deal with the external community, your financial stakeholders, the fans? How did all of that play out?
In real time.
You don't have a book for this, right?
Yeah, I think that the decision we made is to use the media that was already covering this on a more than a day-to-day basis. Right after this occurred, it drew the attention of national media. Obviously, our local media engaged. Social media was robust enough 5 years ago that it was part of ability to message. It really wasn't a time to do much spinning of the situation. it really was more about us being authentic in what we were doing internally with our student athletes and our coaches and staff. Everything they were doing was being covered anyway. So we really relied a lot on leadership perspectives, being very intentional, being very transparent, authentic, as I mentioned, and trying to work with and through the leadership. And I think back to it, the prior work we had done with students in leadership through groups like SAC. We had one on campus that did, at the time called Bridge Builders. I had just started another leadership group with all the captains of our teams. We had been meeting on a regular basis. And each of those groups had internal leadership groups. We really worked with and through them. And it was incredibly helpful. Our staff was great. Our head coaches connected with our teams. And I think that became more of the way we dealt with the media and our stakeholders, because they were already watching everything we did. In all of our training, we're taught about preventing and preparing and responding, working to heal, and what we learn and educate. We obviously couldn't do anything, China, to prevent this. It was out of our hands. Our work to that point had to serve as literally the preparation. And as I mentioned, we were very transparent. So we wanted to be engaging and promoting and facilitating the right kind of conversations. And we knew those would lead to action. And what it led to in our case, I think our student athletes were speaking and using their voice and their platforms through social media. It led to many meetings that we facilitated the safe spaces so they could occur. Sometimes we were in the meetings, sometimes we were intentionally out of the meetings, so it would promote more open dialogue. I think in the big picture, it definitely brought us all together. It led to some longer term plans as well as some short term plans. For instance, the student athletes all wanted to do something that showed unity and solidarity. They came up with a hashtag, Stronger Together, and we created shirts for every student athlete that they would wear. Some of the teams that were in season wore those as warm-up shirts. Our football team was in the middle of spring practice. They wore those shirts. They had a couple of walks, solidarity walks with head coach at the time was Bob Stoops. Was very effective and provided great leadership himself. It created some other groups that we still have today, men of color and women of color. Those are weekly meetings. We've obviously used technology through the pandemic to continue those in Zoom fashion, but prior to then we were meeting on Monday nights, and those were always scheduled so people could come as they could and were interested. Our student athletes created a Martin Luther King Day celebration that they actually organized, and it has now grown to something that's adopted, by campus. So, China, I think it was more let the actions speak louder than the words.
I definitely appreciate that. And eventually when I try to circle back around, I would love to hear about any pushback that you have received from donors. Because, we hear that famous statement, and Dr. Ivey, you can go ahead and chime in on this one, that whole LeBron James issue, shut up and dribble, and typically from a football perspective, football is considered entertainment for many. And for student athletes and athletes in general to step outside of that athletic identity can be a little bit scary. Dr. Ivey, help us understand how you navigated through the community. Were you speaking to any of the media or any parts of the external community to talk about your particular position? Because ultimately you were put in a really bad situation.
Yes, yes, China. Well, the timing of everything, to put it into perspective, this was towards the end of the football season. We were trying to win one or two more games to be bowl eligible. So all of the focus was on that. And it was a complicated situation just because of what was happening on campus and campus leadership. Our head coach had a medical situation that was very serious, and our season came to an abrupt stop where we needed to actually win the last game to be bowl eligible. So we weren't. Season was over. Our head coach resigned and retired. At that point, there was a change in leadership in football, and people that were most of the coaches were not retained by the new coach, and so everything ended abruptly. So there was very little follow-up or time for follow-up, or how do you make sense of what was happening. So I was no longer in my position, probably 6 weeks, probably 4 weeks after that incident happened. So at that point, I went to work on campus. I worked in the chancellor's office. We had an inclusion, diversity, and equity office that was created on campus because of the issues that happened on our campus. And that's what I went to do. I went to work as an assistant vice chancellor in the Office of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. So it was kind of a strange situation where I didn't really get to do the follow-up work to the fallout.
So can I ask the tough question?
These are all tough questions.
Yeah, because this really cost you that position.
And it wasn't just me. It was a lot of us. Of course, there's backlash. Of course, if you were in the community as long as I was, I was a student athlete long enough where Joe Castiglione was still at Missouri. So I had been there 25 plus years as a student athlete and as a assistant AD, director of strength and conditioning. So you hear things, you have a lot of friends in the community. And so there's a lot of, I heard a lot of things about what people thought about that and what they perceived my involvement to be. And there's a lot of finger pointing that happens in those sorts of situations. So I've heard things like, well, the people that are involved must have instigated it. And I've heard things where people have said they would come to the defense of me and others and say, well, if they didn't instigate it, then he should have been the one, or they should have stopped it. He should have stopped it. He should have been the person that stopped it. So it was a can't-win situation, but I learned a lot. Tough situation to go through, but it's one of those things where, I'm stronger because of it.
Well, I definitely appreciate you. And full transparency, everyone, Dr. Ivey used to be my boss when we were at Tulsa, when I did an internship at Tulsa, and just a great leader, and I really appreciate it. Julie, did you have to deal with media? How did you navigate through the external community in regards to these particular issues?
We did. I would say I don't think it's a secret to say that I've been through some crazy days in Fayetteville, Arkansas, unrelated to today's topic. But I will tell you the craziest day was the day after that women's basketball exhibition game. The phones were ringing off the hook all over campus. There were multiple media requests. Our athletic director issued 2 statements. Our president was issuing a statement. It was in all directions. And we had a men's game the following night. So talk radio that day for 8 hours was about whether or not the men's team would also choose to kneel during the national anthem. And when they did not, then that was a thing. And so it just, continued. And I will say, I think if I could I'll come back to your question, but picking up on what Dr. Ivey was just saying, I do think coaches are in an incredibly tenuous position in these times, because they have to, I believe, they have a significant responsibility to their players. And every day they are talking to their players about developing them as young men or women, and encouraging them and talking about developing them in all parts of their life. And at the same time, they come off the practice field, shower, and run to the radio show, where they are then in the position of explaining to a fan base some of these issues in a way that some in our fan bases have not dealt with in the same way that head coaches or assistant coaches have, being that close personally to some of their players. And so it's a tightrope for them. And it certainly was for not just our women's basketball coach at the time, but for all of our coaches at the time, because now everyone was asking them, what were they going to do if someone wanted to kneel? And candidly, expecting of them some of the things that you just described, Dr. Ivey. Are you going to stop it? What are you going to do? Are you going to allow it? And this question of this almost patriarchal role that I think is placed on individuals who are called to these positions for a number of reasons, but a lot of times because they believe in educating young men and women. It's a very difficult situation to navigate. And it doesn't matter if you've watched other institutions go through it or not, it's difficult every time. So my tip of the cap to you, Dr. Ivey, and to others in roles like yours, because it is not easy. People expect a lot more of someone like you than they do of someone like me in those situations. So we were working through all that, and our university leadership was as well. And now all of a sudden, we were behind. We went from being ahead of it to behind it and trying to catch up. And at the same time, our team was crumbling under the pressure of it. Our young women were receiving the most vile messages and comments and being called names personally, and their families, those particularly who were in Arkansas, were receiving nasty calls. And it was really ugly for them for a significant period of time. And, we had players who didn't want to leave their homes, who didn't want to come to practice, didn't want to come to class, didn't want to walk through campus. So we worked through that in the days after, and we had a staff who was faced with some very difficult conversations. 4 years ago, we've been talking all summer about how important these conversations are and how difficult they are. In past years, they've been difficult as well. And so with even less of an environment and less training and support around them, they were trying to work their way through this. And it definitely took a toll on that group. We had politicians who threatened funding to the campus that actually they didn't provide. Arkansas is a self-sustaining athletic department, but nonetheless, it made for good social media. We did have donors who took to social media, and we did have individuals who took to social media and threatened to remove their support. When we went to trace down who those people were, they actually were not donors of ours. And so several people co-opted the opportunity to take a stand on an issue that people were talking about nationally. And it was a very volatile local issue for us.
I definitely appreciate that. We're going to go ahead, in the interest of time, to start fielding some questions. And Katie, are you on the call?
Yes, I'm here, China. Thank you. We do have a number of questions here, but just a reminder to the folks that are joining us on the session today, if you do have questions, please go ahead and submit those via the Q&A feature in your Zoom toolbar. So we'll get started. The first question, how does your institution handle anonymous social media accounts that may be harassing student athletes or even your athletics department? And do you have an institutional policy related to this?
Well, go ahead, and Joe, can you jump in on that one?
Yes. There is a a proactive approach, to monitoring social media. We do it here in our department for a variety of different ways. We've been more intentional and more aware now of the anonymous accounts and the havoc that they can create in a number of different areas. I think really our approach is, to be proactive with our student athletes so they aren't reacting, to some of those anonymous accounts. Easier said than done, of course. Campus is much more engaged now at turning its attention to focusing on the productive, not the reactive. In fact, our president has made diversity, equity, and inclusion the top priority of our campus in the recently released strategic plan. So there are going to be more and more programs roll out as a result of that.
Wonderful. Katie?
Okay, thank you. Our next question. There were most likely differing perspectives regarding these situations from supporters at each of your universities. How did each of you balance and navigate that aspect of these situations?
Julie, would you like to take this one?
Sure. I think that there were public statements of support for our players. I think our head coach at the time was very clear and direct in his support of his players. And I think some of it came down to being responsive, but also taking a deep breath. It did pass. And while there was a significant impact to the individuals in the program at the time, and I don't at all want to minimize that, it looked different on Monday than it did on Friday. It looked different on Friday than it did on Monday. It felt different 2 weeks out. And there were several follow-up items. The players came up with a plan that they called Project Unifi, that they worked with people on campus to operationalize. We hired DE&I professionals to come in and do intensive work with that program afterward to try to help with the healing and try to help make sure that we learned something and there was something going forward for all the pain that had happened after the demonstration. But publicly, we got back to it. And, perhaps there are more strategic ways now, 4 or 5 years later, that we're all using to be not only proactive, but to be responsive. But at the time, we, like a lot of institutions, we got through it. And eventually things, settled down. I will offer now here on my campus, somebody in the Q&A is asking, multiple times, we've gotten a couple of different variations of this question. What would you do now? What would you take away? On this point particularly, we have a social justice group we formed late last spring. And particularly for social media, we created a handle for them. And their messaging and the content they're creating and the things that they want to say together unified come out of a Twitter account and an Instagram account, maybe another one, that are all from Bobcats Lead Change. So our individual student athletes can certainly retweet and forward that content if they want. But if there is anything that is coming back or bouncing back, it primarily goes there and not necessarily to them individually, which gives them a sense of community and gives them a little bit of coverage and unity in that as they're out there in the social media space.
Hey, Katie, do you have a question for Dr. Ivey?
Sure, Dr. Ivey, I do have one specific for you. What are some of the lessons that you took from your time at Mizzou that have helped you prepare for what has been happening at Louisville with the tragic passing of Breonna Taylor?
Great question. I spent a lot of time after what happened on the campus at Missouri, I spent a lot of time reading, going to different seminars, educating myself. It was a nonstop for probably 3 years where I was reading something every day to understand. I wanted to understand politics better. I was down at the state capitol. I wanted to understand the community engagement better. I wanted to understand interactions with donors better. So I spent a lot of time just educating myself, not really knowing that I would be in a similar situation 5 years later with what we have going on with Breonna Taylor. So I just try to, I guess it's very similar. So I just tried to help Vince Tyree, our athletics director, and our senior administrative leadership team, just with my experiences. And it's amazing how similar some of these issues are, and it follows a pattern. So I just try to help those that are actually leading and be there for our student athletes, those who are there for our student athletes as well.
So Joe, lessons learned?
Oh, there's a lot. I'm still learning all the time. One, as much as we all acknowledge systemic racism exists, the various levels of bias, microaggression, again, bias unintended or intended. I think sometimes the simplest things, may get ignored, but they are the seeds that get planted for a later harvest or a more serious situation. So we've been very intentional about making sure the dialogues are open. Like I said, we feel like we have a very open and welcoming campus, but this happened. This was a learned, trained behavior. That song wasn't just created by somebody in their mind, on the bus ride back from the event that they were attending. This was taught, and somebody didn't speak up early enough to stop it before somebody took a video of it. So I think one of the biggest things learned is to make sure we're talking and understanding what our student athletes are going through. We might have a very inclusive environment. We talk about all these diversity programs. That's only part of it. Diversity is just a piece of it. It's inclusion. And what our student athletes are going, how do they feel, how they're being treated, how are they taught, what did they experience? And by the way, not just student athletes, but our coaching staff and our administrative staffs. They are feeling the same things. They are fathers and mothers and sisters and brothers who have people they're responsible for, and having to explain these things to them. I think what we've learned a lot and since is open the dialogue, understand what they're facing, do what we can to step up and take action, know our why, and follow through.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, even after the devastating death of George Floyd continued, it continued with Daniel Prude, Rashad Brooks, and others. This is not a partisan issue. It's not a geographic issue, not a gender issue. It's a human issue. And we all need to be involved and engaged to take it from protests to programming to policies. So Joe, Pat, Julie, thank you very much for sharing what happened on your campus. These are lessons learned. I do encourage everyone to go back and Google some of these case studies, because we definitely can learn from these great leaders. Thank you very much for your time. And Bob, it's on you.
Thank you all. China, thank you for your leadership on not only the committee, but this very important issue, this very important session. Joe, Pat, Julie, your candor, your transparency, it just shows what we're all about in college athletics, right? I mean, we compete like heck on the playing fields, on the hard courts, but when it comes to administration, sharing ideas, sharing concepts, sharing life lessons, exactly what we did today. So thank you all very much. And we look forward to our next social justice session in about 3 weeks. So have a great day, everyone. Good luck this weekend for those that are playing, and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you all.